Hello and welcome to INSPIRE's Unplugged Dialogue series. INSPIRE is a Rise in Europe project that has started in October 2022 and will finish at the end of September 2026. The aim of INSPIRE is to create the European Centre of Excellence. This centre focuses on inclusive gender equality in research and innovation and could be summarized as having two main aims. The first aim is to build up and strengthen the evidence base on how to integrate intersectionality into gender equality plans and equity, diversity and inclusion plans. The second one is to provide practical support to 12 communities of practice in which 90 organizations approximately are working together to design, implement and evaluate inclusive change processes. I would like to welcome not one but two guests today to the Unplugged Dialogue series. They are both members of the Include project. This project focuses on developing intersectional gender equality plans, more specifically in biomedical research. Today's first guest is Dounia Barabain. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the School of Social Sciences at Hasselt University and also contributes to policy making in Belgium. Her work centers on gender and ethno-racial inequality within research organizations and more specifically focuses on identifying barriers for underrepresented students and academics and also investigating the development and impact of EDI cultures in academia. Fun fact, in 2023, she received the Emma Goldman Snowball Award for her contribution and engagement to feminist and inequality issues in Europe, and is the co-host of the podcast Joy in Academia, which I listened and very much enjoyed. Welcome, Dounia. Our second guest is Maria Sangiuliano. She's a research director at SmartVenice and an Italian consultant specializing in gendered and inclusive innovation. As a senior expert, her work focuses on gender and intersectional equality across research, technology, and public policy, and her work combines both social sciences and STS-based action research. She has led several EU-funded projects, more specifically on inclusive gender equality plans, and often serves as a scientific coordination, providing guidance to research organizations. More recently, she also focuses on feminist responses to anti-gender mobilizations. Welcome, Maria. To start, I would like to emphasize how both in your project and in ours, we observe that intersectionality is increasingly being inquired in research on equality policies and also being integrated in public policies at the EU level, national level, and within research organizations. However, there seems to be still limited practical knowledge or consensus on how to develop such policies. So first question, perhaps to you, Maria, could you explain what intersectional gender equality plans mean in practice and why an intersection approach is so crucial for equality work in research organizations?
Thanks a lot, Joanna. To reply to your question, I think it is important to remind that the definition of intersectionality, it is not new. It dates back to 1989, as the term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an Afro-American civil rights advocate and a legal scholar. Crenshaw used the concept to highlight the multiple, complex, and interconnected forms of discrimination and oppression faced by Afro-American women who in legal cases were considered either as Black or as women, so that the specific intertwined discriminations they were subject to remained invisible and unaddressed. Even earlier than the 80s, though, Black feminists were vocal in criticizing the universalism implicit in most of white feminism. Both in the US and within global debates during conferences on the status of women held by the United Nations in particular. It is precisely aiming at moving beyond a conception of gender equality that is just looking on inequalities between men and women, and overcomes a definition of women being all equal and a monolithic group of subjects. Interestingly, gender equality plans have been considered and promoted by the European Commission as tools to promote institutional change in research organizations since the last 13 years at least. But the way they were implemented until I would say before 2020 was mostly binary, I would dare to say. So not really focusing on intersectionality. Starting since 2020, and in particular the adoption of the European gender equality strategy, the policy discourse in Europe has started referring to inclusive gender equality plans. So the new policy goal has become promoting gender equality plans that takes into account need and claims of women from different minorities, spanning from race-based discrimination and to sexual orientation and gender identity, class, of course, age, religion, and different abilities as well. So in a way, I think we caught up something that was already integrated in gender studies in terms of intersectionality scholarship. It took a bit of time to get there, but finally this attention started to develop, and I believe that there is a tendency to stress or to focus a lot on how it is difficult to practice intersectionality and how it is such a good theory, but so much difficult to practice it. But I would really like us all to go beyond this, because I think it's a risky type of statement that risks to undervalue intersectionality as a theoretical concept, and overestimating the fact that if we don't have immediate practical tools or immediate measurable effects, well, then maybe it's not the right way to go.
Yeah, thank you. I think this immediacy of effects is very relevant. Maybe Dounia, you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree already with what Maria has said, especially in the sense that we have made quite an important transformation when it comes to the development of gender equality policies and equality work, like in general, because I want to emphasize that equality work that ignores intersectionality often ends up helping those who are already close to power, right? We've seen in past research that the GPs that were put in place often focus on improving the conditions of women, but this was a very restrictive understanding or definition of who these women were. So it's often middle class, able-bodied, white women that we tended to focus on. And I think now with this understanding of intersectionality, it allows us to look beyond that. And especially also, I mean, I think it requires more kind of like institutional reflexivity in that sense, because with intersectionality, we really explicitly make power visible. So that also means that we're also critically examining what does these, supposedly neutral norms of excellence, of professionalism, of merit, what does that actually mean? What does that entail? Is this actually neutral, or is this privileging certain groups? And I feel that with this understanding of intersectionality, we're now better at making that visible in the work that we do. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Thank you so much. I also found it interesting when you were mentioning, of course, certain institutional norms, certain institutional structures, especially looking at research organization or higher education. So in your project, actually, you focus on intersectional gender equality plans within biomedical research, so centering actually already at a level of research organizations. So what are some particular challenges that you have identified or faced when trying to introduce certain intersectional policies or gender equality plans within these specific contexts?
Yeah, maybe to put the question a bit more in context, I think it helps to start with some of the earlier research that I've also conducted on the challenges when it comes to introducing intersectional GEPs, and especially its connection to what extent these equality work is actually supported in Europe. And I've actually looked at how academics mostly evaluate different kinds of equality measures or action plans. And we actually see that support for these kind of equality work is widespread, but it's highly differentiated. So we can say that academics are, simply for or against equality, and then also for or against these equality policies, but that it really depends on where they work in the first place, but also on what kind of action you're actually proposing. And so a very important difference that I've seen in my prior work is actually disciplinary. And so we see that academics in the social sciences and the humanities, they tend to show stronger support for these kind of equality measures than those in the life sciences and the exact sciences. And this is not because these scholars are, less committed to equality, but these fields are often more strongly organized around these neutral norms or supposedly neutral norms that we just discussed. So ideas of meritocracy, of objectivity, of scientific neutrality really stands much more central in what they're doing. And so as a result, structural explanations of inequality tend to resonate less easily. And so we know that then equality measures are kind of assessed in terms of what could be their impact in terms of excellence, but also especially in terms of fairness. And then a second difference that's really important to mention here is also the type of equality measure or action that you want to introduce. So we also see again across disciplines, but then especially in the life sciences and exact sciences, there is much stronger support for these kind of differential measures. So differential measures are mentoring programs or these inclusive formalized recruitment criteria, voluntary bias training, developing diversity committees. So these kind of measures that improve procedures, but they still kind of center merit-based evaluation. We're not specifically targeting a specific group to improve their position. But by contrast, if you're focusing on preferential measures, so these are, for example, quotas or mandatory bias training, then we notice that they tend to receive less support. And that is because they require much more, or stronger intervention in, for example, existing evaluation systems. And then again, it raises concerns about neutrality, about excellence, and so on. And so in Include, we've actually also been looking at what are the current gaps within the biomedical field and the institutes that we're working with. And one of the things that we have noticed based on the gender equality plans that we could analyze and the interviews that we conducted was in the first place that there is much more need of leadership involvement. And so what does that mean? That means that obviously leadership engagement is very important and that this should move beyond signing off plans, because that's something that they really work towards. But it's important that they're also part of rethinking how can we, for example, allocate budgets, in what sense can we set priorities on intersectional change, and also again having this discussion about does neutral excellence actually exist? So what are these norms that we are working with? And that is connected to a second gap that we saw, and that is the lack of dedicated resources, but also expertise to implement these gender equality plans. So we saw that most institutes either have some budget, but where you don't exactly know how big that budget is compared to like the overall institutional budget. So there's no transparency about that yet. Or they actually don't have a budget at all, which makes it very difficult because then you're focusing on people that do this on a volunteering basis. It's usually the same kind of people that push this kind of work in the institute. So that's also definitely something that we've noticed as well. But also, and I think that's also maybe important to mention, and that's actually also what Maria has already mentioned before, is the understanding of intersectionality. For many, it's still very difficult to realize what that actually entails. How can we actually put that into practice? And I think that's also why this project is important, I believe, because it's going to provide these more, these tools and these very practical solutions to certain issues and gaps that they are dealing with. So these were several things that we have noticed in our gap analysis as part of this project.
Thank you. Maria, is there something you wanted to add to this?
Thank you. I definitely agree with the emphasis Dounia put on issues related to power and privilege when it comes to understandings of intersectionality, but also in reference to the disciplinary structures that feature academia and knowledge production that are definitely placing hard sciences at the top of the hierarchy in terms of knowledge production, and social sciences to which gender studies and gender knowledge are connected to at a lower sort of level. So indeed, there is this paradox that we try to promote a plugging in of concept generated from social sciences, as well as the related policies, inclusive gender equality plans, within hard sciences such as biomedical institutions. And we often have to struggle with difficulties in interdisciplinary dialogues and stereotypes from hard scientists thinking, well, these are sort of fluffy concepts that are not really strongly evidence-based, and what we should do with that. Sometimes attention is posed nowadays because gender equality plans are eligibility criterion in Horizon Europe, and so there is this normative push in a way, but also in the case of projects on gender equality plans like Include, there are resources that comes along. So the commitment from leadership is sometimes, double-sided, in a way, and there's a lot to work on that. Concretely speaking, and this is a bit paradoxical, but in biomedical sciences are also a disciplinary field where a lot of knowledge has been made available on case studies on how to integrate gender dimension into the content and methods of the research. This is because gender medicine has become quite prominent and has its own tradition of research, I would say. So in Include, when we had to prepare the trainer courses, for example, we didn't have to struggle too much in finding good scientific papers and studies on the importance and the value and the how-to of integrating gender in the content of this particular disciplinary field, even though maybe an intersectional approach to that is not always there, but there is a tendency to, distinguish between male and female bodies mostly, and when in studies on medical sciences, this is still very much the case. Well, last remark, maybe on the laboratory culture. I think there is a lot to explore further on the specific organizational dynamics and specific organizational cultures happening in laboratories, in research laboratories, that of course are at the core of biomedical research. And I was just smiling with myself, thinking back at an hashtag activism example that took place, I think it was almost 10 years ago, but maybe you remember this, after a Nobel laureate came out on the media with statements on how female researchers can be distracting in laboratories. A huge wave of feminist hashtag activism pop up on the social media with the hashtag distractingly sexy. And a lot of mostly biomedical researchers posting pictures of themselves in humorous poses in the labs, to really dismantle and use humor against that stereotype and bias, which was shared by, such a prominent scientist.
Thank you so much for this example. So indeed, reflecting on what you were saying, at the organizational level, we see that especially a commitment of leadership, the expertise or the knowledge should be built, and then also resources are quite important to do this intersectional equality work. We've also talked about resistances within these organizations, but outside of the institutions, we actually also see broader socio-political resistances arising not only within the US academic context, but also within the European contexts. How has this increasing resistance to equality work at large affected your work, your research, your practices towards intersectional JEPs or EDI policies? And maybe also afterwards, how are some things that you try to overcome it?
Yeah, so I'm not a practitioner myself, so I can't say exactly like how it has impacted the implementation of EDI when I tried to do that, but I did do research on the resistances specifically within academic institutions then. And it is true that what we see at the moment, alongside movements like Me Too, decolonial student campaigns, the Black Lives Matter movement, which have really pushed research institutions and academic institutions to confront, amongst others, sexual harassment, structural racism, and violence, that there has also been a growing counter-mobilization happening in Europe. And we've seen, over the past decade, this anti-gender and anti-race discourse that has gained ground, often also using language of, academic freedom and language of free speech to portray that this kind of gender conscious and race conscious scholarship, that it is a threat to what they're doing, sometimes labeled as woke ideology, whatever that may mean. And in that framing, we also indeed see that EDI policies are also, blamed for restricting this debate, because our academic institutions and research institutions are, according to this counter politics, perceived as already post-feminist and already post-racist. So the problem is basically solved. Why should we be, developing these gender equality policies or equality work in general? And we specifically see that intersectionality has been a target, right? We see this clearly in the US, but also in Europe, that it is dismissed as some kind of like identity politics, and then it gets delegitimized as, a tool of research, but also of policy. And so the effect is here that equality work then becomes more contested and it receives less ground within our institutions. And maybe if I can tie this also to the more qualitative work that has been conducted and that I also conducted in two specific national contexts, so in Belgium and Denmark, because of the fact that there was a very huge, Me Too movement and mobilization going on within academic institutions. And I was actually interested in looking at how do, university leadership then support, but also understand gender equality work. So what do they do with that? How do they perceive it, and so on? And so what I've seen based on interviews that I've conducted with university leadership is that within this context, leadership definitely does not deny the existence of, for example, a gender gap, because we have the statistics and we can clearly show that there is a leaky pipeline and so on. But the inequality that comes forth of this gender gap is often not understood as an urgent institutional problem. So I've looked into the arguments that they've used, and they tend to frame this gender gap, for example, as a normal feature of academia. So mostly looking at it from a meritocratic or a neoliberal lens, indicating still this very strong belief that if you work hard enough, that everyone will have the opportunity to succeed, but it's also at the same time that there is a neoliberal crisis going on within the institution, and that actually leads to a crisis for everyone, and that this is not necessarily gender-based or race-based or whatever. And also a very important argument that came up was that these issues, so when we talk about gender inequality, but also racial inequality, for example, that it will naturally resolve over time. So this is, I believe, also tied to why at the moment we still don't see very big budgets allocated to this kind of equality work, because there is also this belief that it will eventually happen, this has to do with generational effects. And so that is why it shouldn't be a top priority within the institution. So we see on the one hand then that this EDI work or equality work or gender equality work is supported in principle, but it's rarely constructed as, a crisis that requires immediate or structural intervention. So that means that there is not necessarily very explicit or overt resistance on an everyday basis, but it narrows the space in which equality work can operate. And that's what I've clearly also seen in the work that I've done.
Maria, maybe also to you, as you have quite a lot of experience working on inclusive gender equality plans, working within Horizon Europe projects, what role do you then think these policies can play to try and overcome these resistances at institutional level or broader?
Yes, I think this is a difficult one, but also, it is to me quite evident that the overall political climate and the landscape we live in has been deteriorating in the last few years. Particularly, I would say, this is visible since the last elections at the European Parliament, where far-right political actors have gained a lot of space, and it is not by chance and contestations happening at the European Parliament earlier this year. News were spread on the media about the European Commission supposedly intending to dilute the inclusive gender equality plan's eligibility criterion to access Horizon Europe funds. Such announced risks then triggered mobilizations from the research and practitioners communities active on gender equality. And luckily, at the end, the inclusive JEP requirement was safeguarded. But inevitably, what is happening in the United States in terms of attacks to EDI policies is having an influence in Europe as well. Further, I would say encouraging inner trends that manifested earlier on in the last years in some of the EU member states. I'm thinking of existing bans on gender studies and or on LGBTQI+ mobilizations and policies, or threats to reproductive rights, or for example, the lack of advancement in ratifying the Istanbul Convention in 6 EU countries, or even active political efforts to withdraw from the convention in certain cases. So I really believe that this has a direct impact on EDI and gender equality policies, both on the response from leadership and more in general from the researchers and research staff. There is much more caution, I would say, and less willingness to speak openly about these topics. Also, concerns that these are not topics that are, popular any longer. And we should not invest in those any longer. So we are quite at a critical point in time. Luckily, after those news on the risks that the Horizon Europe eligibility criterion on JEPs would have been at risk, mobilizations from the research communities and the practitioner communities took place, and this was stopped. But I think we need to be prepared to a continued sort of resistance to this. In practical terms, if I look at my experience with supporting institutional change in research organizations, I think the examples of resistances linked to anti-gender discourses and actors were quite diversified, I would say. It happened to me to have anti-gender actors, people with a clear-cut anti-gender position, even leading gender equality working groups within projects in a totally unexpected way, for reasons of lack of attention from the leadership, bad selection of the person in charge. But it happened to me that we expected in this working group to have a sound reflection and an evidence-based reflection on how and why D&I policies would be needed for that institution, and what was actually happening instead was discussions on how too far feminists have gone in society and how much men are discriminated against, and so we should stop this. And that was, I think, the most paradoxical examples that I had to face, and it was really internal. But I also experienced cases where influence from external actors was blocking and generating internal resistances in the research organizations, like claims made by members of the national parliaments, denouncing the coming too far of gender equality policies within organizations of that country, bringing that particular institution as a negative example in a parliamentary debate, and the leadership of the organizations, starting to doubt about their commitment to gender equality at that point. And all of the negotiations that followed, and all of the requests to dilute and potentially and possibly to go back to at least a binary formulation of gender equality policies considered as more acceptable, supposedly so.
Yeah, connecting it actually back to your Include project. So we have mapped quite clearly that there's still and continuous resistance against intersectionality, against equality work at multiple levels. And those are actually also reinforcing themselves. But what is also very interesting in your Include project is that you're trying to map these resistances on the one hand, but also try to move towards actually overcoming these barriers and actually working towards intersectional gender equality plans. And one of the interesting topics, which we also in INSPIRE are trying to work on, is the idea of data collection and intersectional data to map actually also the resistances, but actually also the inequalities within these research organizations. From your work in Include or outside from research, what have you learned about collecting and using intersectional data effectively to foster institutional change?
Yeah, so from our work in Include, one of the main, I think, lessons that we've seen when it comes to intersectional data is that at the moment, most institutions are not there yet. So the majority is still collecting gender desegregated data predominantly. Sometimes we see that it is combined with a few other categories, like, for example, age, but actual intersectional data collection remains rare. In addition, what we also see is that when it's collected, it's not really looking at key institutional processes, like, for example, hiring, promotion, exit, the use of flexible work arrangements, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's really something that definitely needs to be worked on, because if we don't really track these transitions over time, institutions won't simply see, who's being left behind, when and where. And maybe one key example that I want to give here about, why this intersectional data collection is so important, and how we see that actually if we only collect gender desegregated data, that it can produce sometimes misleading stories. And one has to do with, the well-known idea of the leaky pipeline. So the leaky pipeline says the more you move up in academia, the less women we tend to see. And this is often treated as a universal experience, so for all women in academia. But then once you introduce an intersectional lens, that narrative actually falls apart. So women are not pushed out in the same way and at the same time in academia. If you, for example, would include the ethno-racial background of women, that already makes a significant difference. So often we see that they leave or are pushed out from their academic career much earlier in that process. And so key lessons, I think, are fairly practical. So we need consistent data collection across institutional stages, but also we need to follow people through the processes and the transitions that they go through. So with intersectional data, it's not just about the overall head count. We don't just want to have an idea of how many women of color we have or how many disabled women we have and so on. We really want to see what happens over time and in these key transitions. And what I would also want to add is that besides the quantitative data, it's extremely important to actually also combine this with qualitative data and qualitative insights to really understand what actually happens behind the numbers. The numbers are the start, to give us an impression of what is happening and where, but then often to actually come with practical solutions, we need the qualitative research as well. So I really believe that with intersectional data, it's supposed to identify blind spots in the institutions. It's not to monitor, it's not to stigmatize individuals. So we really have to have a very clear aim in that sense.
Thank you so much. So we're already coming towards the end. Thank you so much for your insights. I think reflecting on also with the work we do in INSPIRE, we also see these challenges and we also try to overcome these. So to end on really looking towards the future and actually what we can do right now, what listeners can do right now to try and implement an intersectional approach within their EDI policies or equality policies. What are some of the strategies or approaches that you see as most promising for advancing institutional change, really using these intersectional equality policies to move this forward?
Maybe I start this one. All right. Which is again an interesting but not super easy question. But linking back to what we were sharing earlier on and what Dounia was rightly pointing out on intersectional data collection that are crucial, I would say this is something that we recommended to include partners and that we actually had as a requirement within another GEP project, the Nexus that just concluded, having intersectional data collection as an area of intervention for the gender equality plans. I think this is really important. It is not part of the main requirements of the GEP criterion. It's not one of the building blocks, but it is extremely relevant. So whenever designing a gender equality plan, I think that research organizations should try to do something, include a dedicated action to improve data collection in their organization in a way that addresses intersectionality more profoundly, qualitatively and quantitatively. And then I would also say, in consideration of the resistance that we mentioned earlier on, and of the fact that intersectionality and an attack to intersectionality is really deep at the core of the anti-gender contestations and rhetorics, it is extremely important that we transform intersectionality from being a source of resistance to a venue for alliances and solidarity. So trying to promote as much as possible intersectional alliances from the bottom up, and in particular using participatory methods, inclusive dialogues that support making the voices of researchers and academic staffs from minority groups heard in the process of designing and implementing policies.
Dounia, are there some words of advice from your experience, your research, that you would give to our listeners who want to take some lessons forwards to go towards intersectional institutional change?
Yeah. I absolutely agree with Maria that we should also focus on, these alliances and solidarities also from the bottom up. I think they're extremely important in the times that we are in. And at the same time, I also don't want to remove the responsibility of, the institutions to make work of this. And I mean, I can reiterate what I have mentioned before, that intersectional change requires leadership engagement. Intersectional change requires resources. We cannot expect from those that are already working at the margins, it's usually women of color that are working on equality in their institutions, which means that it's also based on goodwill. It's usually short-term projects. It's very much based on, the voluntary, work that they do. And we need to move beyond that, because if we don't do it, then, intersectionality will always remain vulnerable and seen as an extra instead of, it being essential. And, we've been talking about gender mainstreaming for the last 2 decades, I think, and it's actually the same thing that we need with intersectionality, that it's not isolated in diversity offices or in standalone policies. It really needs to shape everything that we do in terms of recruitment, in terms of promotion criteria, leadership selection, workload allocation, research evaluation, teaching practices. It's literally in everything that we do. And I think that is actually what we also should keep on emphasizing, that the institutions also remain responsible for making this work. So that's, what I would say.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights, also experiences. I think it resonates a lot with me, also trying to integrate intersectionality more as just a theory, but really something you have to put in practice continuously, taking into account these resistances, of course. So I'm really happy that you made time for this unplugged dialogue. And I look forward to seeing also more results of the Include and, of course, your research and practice-based work. And then I'm going to finish